Emeritus for Phillips Petroleum. I joined Phillips Petroleum out of graduate school in 1956, and really it's the only company I've ever worked for, although I'm an adjunct professor of chemical engineering at Oklahoma State University. I joined Phillips largely because they funded my graduate work, and I was a Phillips Petroleum Fellow. I went to thank them for the money and the effort and support, on the research grant. And gee, I went there and it was hot, but I liked it, and I found the people as warm as the weather, and so I stayed, and I stayed, and I stayed. And initially I thought maybe a year or 2 or 3, and time just passed, and I've grew up there, raised a family there, and I've liked it. I started working in the hydrocarbon processes branch, but in those days the hydrocarbon processes branch was catalysis, and we did little else, and we still do little else. It's mostly catalysis, and our driving interest, is catalysis or separation or some combination of that. I started at Phillips. I think the first thing that I did was I started doing hydrogenation catalysts. At the time, Phillips was interested in cyclohexane. So we started out recovering naturally occurring cyclohexane, and then we'd isomerize methylcyclopentane and add it to the mix, and then we'd do the isomerization at low temperatures and convert it to cyclohexane, and we made a lot of naturally occurring cyclohexane from that purpose. But the purity was never high enough to really suit our customers, and so we started, when UDEX extraction came out, we started recovering, high purity benzene and hydrogenating it with a nickel catalyst to cyclohexane. We still use, with very little change, the same process. What has changed is the catalyst. It's much better, it's much more active, and it's a lot more selective than it used to be. And so we produced high purity cyclohexane since 1964 by this process. Largely, most companies use catalysts that we developed internally, or one thing or other, or we taught them how to use, and it's been a very successful venture. I was really interested in hydrogenation, particularly selective hydrogenation. So we cast off from there, and I think the next real project that I worked on to any great extent was rubber hydrogenation. And it was about this time that a short article came out in Journal of Catalysis that I read it, and they were talking about homogeneous hydrogenation catalysts based on nickel octaweight, or nickel, essentially an organic solvent, a nickel compound, not nickel naphthenate, but something very similar to that would reduce with TEA. And they cited that they could hydrogenate, benzene with this and make cyclohexane. That wasn't our interest, and we never could get the conversion high enough, nor do we have a process. But we were very interested in rubber hydrogenation at that time, and we tried a variety of nickel catalysts for rubber hydrogenation, everything from the rainy nickels to the catalysts, the powdered forms of the benzene hydrogenation catalyst. But the reaction was very slow and very thin. And so when this development came out, we started hydrogenating polymers, and it was my suggestion that we ought to start looking at the viscosity index improvers. And so we started out hydrogenating butadiene styrene polymers. We would hydrogenate the olefin unsaturation out of them, and then they became excellent, very thermally stable, excellent viscosity index improvers, particularly if they were somewhat random. In other words, they weren't block butadiene, block polystyrene. And we did that. The process went commercial. Phillips largely used its rubber plant that it had at or near Borger, Texas. And we prepared a lot of high purity, well, not high purity because that's probably a misnomer, but completely hydrogenated butadiene styrene rubbers for viscosity index improvers. We did that for a number of years. I think our friends at Lubrizol still do that and employ, essentially the catalyst and the raw materials that were developed with our polymer friends and our hydrogenation expertise. After that, non-Tabler and I got very interested in alloy catalysts, or catalysts where nickel wasn't the only active moiety. Particularly, we were very interested in preparing a compound, cyclopentene from cyclopentadiene. And we looked at nickel subsulfide for this, and it did work. The difficulty was it would deactivate, and the temperatures involved, we would get polymer formation in the catalyst, and it was never really a very successful route to the corresponding olefin, which in that case would be cyclopentene. But we developed this interest in looking at nickel catalysts and nickel alloy catalysts, and one of the ones we looked at was nickel arsenide, and it was an amazingly selected catalyst. We could take almost any diolefin, and if it were conjugated, it would hydrogenate it to the corresponding olefin with very, very high selectivities, particularly in the presence of small amounts of carbon monoxide or acetone or some other polar molecule. This led us to look at more, and particularly the nickel arsenide, which is Ni3As2-X. It's a non-Daltonide, and it's very similar to nickel sulfide, but it's more active, it's more selective, and with presence of suitable modifiers, it's just more tractable. And we hydrogenated cyclooctadiene to cyclooctane, duodecitriene to cycloduodecene. We hydrogenated styrene to the corresponding olefins and butadiene, the whole list. And there wasn't much of anything that we didn't hydrogenate. But that led essentially to us looking at other things in the same row on the periodic chart. One of those was nickel antimony. Now, it was never the selected hydrogenation catalyst that nickel arsenide was, and it was more difficult to prepare because the aqueous chemistry is very, very limited. But we prepared nickel antimony catalysts, and one of the reactions that we looked at was conversion or clipping of methyl cyclohexane to cyclohexane. And this is a reaction I'd studied with nickel catalyst some time earlier. And our thought was there, we'll take and pass toluene over nickel catalyst, we'll hydrogenate it to methyl cyclohexane, and then we'll use the clipping activity for nickel to take the side chains off of the aromatic and end up with cyclohexane combined more or less in one step. All of the properties that we did in two, which was thermal cleaving of the toluene to benzene and then separation. And we tried it with the nickel antimony catalyst. It was a reaction that I was familiar with, I'd had some experience with. So Tabler made the catalyst and I tried it, and gee, you wouldn't have thought there was any nickel there. I mean, we took methyl cyclohexane, we didn't clip any rings, we got a little bit of toluene, but none of the hydrogenolysis activity out of nickel antimony alloy catalyst that we got out of nickel catalyst. And we'd always had an interest in cat cracking. You can't be in the petroleum industry long, and you can't do heavy oil cracking like Phillips did for all these years and not be aware of the difficulties of accumulation of nickel and vanadium on cracking catalysts. And so I turned to Tabler and I said, Don, I think we've got a metals passivation. And he says, what's that, Marvin? And then I said, oh, where nickel accumulates on all our heavy oil cracking catalysts. I think if we put antimony on that, we might have a winner. And so we did some thinking, and basically we thought, well, it'll form the alloy, and when we oxidize it and regenerate, it'll go back to antimony trioxide, particularly at the conditions of the regenerator at those times, which you're reducing pretty much. And then the antimony trioxide will be mobile. It's a low melting alloy oxide. It'll redistribute itself, and so we'll have a perpetual regeneration of the catalyst, and we'll be able to offset the nickel on the catalyst. Well, on the basis of nothing more profound than those arguments and the observation that a small amount of antimony offset a lot of nickel, metals passivation was born. And we tested it once or twice. We had some difficulty in reproducing results, but it became clear that the antimony metal passivation was a real fact of life. And so it kicked around Phillips for 2 or 3 years, before we could convince others to try it in one of our reactors, literally Unit 40 in Borger. But we kept worrying about how we would put it on, and I said it didn't matter. Put it on, throw the trioxide in the regenerator, it'll probably melt and stick. But finally we went to I'm trying to think of what it is, but it's the antimony, the trialkyl dithiol phosphate, of antimony, which they use as an EP additive, and it's oil soluble. So that was the way they chose to introduce the antimony into the catalyst on some of the first steps. It worked extremely well. They tried it, and the longer they ran it, the amount of methane, the amount of hydrogen, the amount of coke decreased on the catalyst, and the crack gas compressor just unwound. It went from a high-pitched sound to something which was much more moderate, didn't drive everybody insane, and virtually, you know, we knew we had a success. I didn't test it. I wasn't part of that, but I got a call from Dale, Glenn Dale, who did the testing, and he says, I think you've got something. Well, on the basis of nothing more profound than that, I guess, you know, metals passivation was born. Phillips, you know, commercialized on it. They put a couple of very good people, Dwight McKay and Brent Burtis, on building a picket fence, so to speak, around metals passivation. And Tabler and I went off and we stayed with our interest, which were alloy catalyst and hydrogenation. And I've never been sorry. I probably have a lot more patents, but I really don't need a lot more anyway. But we went off and we did some other things. And one of the things that we did was we started looking at we've always wanted to make cyclohexene, with the idea that we could get cyclohexene, we could, you know, hydrate it, make cyclohexanol, or then cleave it, and we'd have a better route to, you know, to adipic acid. And so Gary Nowak and I did a lot of this, and we started looking at ruthenium for this purpose, because it's active in the aqueous phase, and about that time we were aware of some of the peculiarities of ruthenium, and we started hydrogenating, and we came up with you know, a catalyst that made fairly decent yields of cyclohexene, but catalyst stability was always a problem, and in our hands we could never get the ruthenium, which would deactivate, to regenerate. And so we sort of walked away from that project, but it was picked up, and we were looking at it for making, we put it on a molecular sieve, Ernie Zuick and I did, and we made phenylcyclohexane. And the book is still out on whether or not that is a valuable product, but you can make, you know, it's like cumene. You can peroxidize it real well, you know, destroy the peroxide on an acid catalyst. You can make phenol and cyclohexanol, and or cyclohexanone, and you could hydrogenate that, you know, or hydrogenate the phenol, and you could have the best of all possible worlds. But we were the first to really explore, you know, the use of in our case, nickel and zinc and other of that period, lower part of the periodic chart, you know, first row transition metals on ruthenium to get selective hydrogenation of benzene to cyclohexene, or in the presence of an acid catalyst to recover the phenylcyclohexane. But for a variety of reasons, you know, it's something we never commercialized, although we were interested in it. But we also stayed with selective hydrogenation, and one of the problems that we had at the time is that we were using a palladium catalyst, and it worked extremely well as long as the carbon monoxide was very high. By high, I mean above 1,000 parts per million, to hydrogenate acetylene to ethylene. In other words, part of our ethylene purification train. We previously had taken this out with dimethylformamide by the solvent extraction process, but we'd always burn off or throw away, you know, the acetylene. We didn't recover it at all, like so many other companies did, you know, to make acetylene-based chemicals with the acetylene, you know, diol, and to, you know, to hydrogenate that to make the tetrahydrofuran or any of those things. But we went ahead and started looking at palladium catalysts, and palladium alloy catalysts in particular. And about that time we were having a lot of problems. We changed the metallurgy in our cracking furnaces. We got a dramatic change in the amount of carbon monoxide present, and moreover, anytime we'd introduce even trace amounts of sulfur-containing compounds in the cracking tubes, the amount of carbon monoxide would plummet, the reactors would run away. We had all that hydrogen, all of that ethylene there, you know, and boom, we'd go from 200 or 150 degrees F up to 700-800 degrees, and we'd quench the reactor out, and it was several days before we could get it back online. And I made a comment at a meeting. I didn't think much of the selective hydrogenation catalyst, in particular the palladium catalyst, and I thought we ought to maybe be a little bit pickier about what we chose. And And the vice president remembered this, and one time we were down, he called me and said, if I'm so good, why didn't I get out there to Sweeney, Texas and help them? And so I went out and we did help them. In a matter of a couple of days, we had the plant operating, much better. And at the next catalyst change, we produced a palladium on a alumina catalyst that we liked, and it ran for 22 years. And but this wasn't an alloy catalyst, and again, we changed the metallurgy. We were always trying to increase the yields, get higher per pass conversions, but we always did this at the expense of the amount of carbon monoxide in the tail gas. And so when we purified all this, we had lesser and lower amounts of carbon monoxide. And the interesting thing is that it would start out at 300 or 400 parts per million, and by the time we got out there, it would be 50, 2 or 3 weeks later. And then we had a lot of problems with it. So we introduced one of our so-called special catalysts, which were silver palladium alloy catalysts. And they were tremendously successful. They became more or less the industry standard. We used them, and still use them to this day. But and they're very good. And again, they kept pushing the metallurgy of the tubes, reducing the amount of carbon monoxide. We gotten away from the treating our catalyst to tubes and burning them out constantly, and one thing and another. But we've introduced yet a third generation of palladium on aluminum catalyst, this time silver with another promoter, largely to control the sensitivity to carbon monoxide. And again, we're still selling selective hydrogenation catalysts, based on silver, and I guess the patents are out, potassium fluoride, for this purpose, and it's kind of become the industry standard now. And so if I had to summarize my life, I've been working in catalysts all my life. I guess my biggest success financially was metals passivation, which we did use extensively at Phillips and licensed to virtually every petroleum refinery in the country, particularly those that had an interest in heavy crudes or had contamination, with nickel. The second one would have to be, the acetylene hydrogenation. And in a nutshell, I've summarized 46 years of work on the basis of the industrial successes. Now, have I had a great time? I've had a great time. I find that I still love science. I liked it. I liked it when I was 8 years old. I had an uncle who was a professor of metallurgy at the University of Utah, and I thought he was the neatest thing that ever walked, and he encouraged me to go into science, and I did, and I've never been sorry. My father thought that, like my uncle, I would never make enough money to support a family, and so he convinced me after I got a BS in chemistry to get a BS in chemical engineering so that I wouldn't be a perpetual drain on him or his estate, and I did. And then I went back and I got a doctorate in engineering. By inclination and interest, I guess I'm a chemist. I love them both, but I certainly like chemistry better than I like the engineering, and I do more of it. But I'm still active. I'm still working with a number of people at Phillips. I've been a part of a number of exploratory investigations, and we have a couple now that are looking very good. I'm part of the SSORB team, which is the sulfur removal team, and I've contributed to that. And we've got some other developments in mind, that I think will be commercialized and show promise. I don't know how much longer I'll stay around. They might walk in and say someday, Marvin, we just don't need you any longer. And I think I'll just say so long and goodbye and tell them what a great time I had and thank them for the office that I've occupied all these years. But I have all these friends at Phillips, and they always worked, at all these different places. They traveled here, they traveled there, they transferred here, and I once, out of curiosity, decided how far I went in the company. And guys, I went 135 feet. I went from a laboratory with a desk, an old desk, when I arrived, adjacent to the laboratory, to an office with a laboratory adjacent to it, and there I've been all these years. I've had a great time. I do it over. I would encourage everybody I know to get into science and to stay active in it. It's a very rich and rewarding profession, if not financially, for the neat people you meet and the fun you can have. And I guess that's all my story.
Well, one of the areas of Phillips is the chromia polymerization catalyst. How did you avoid that?
Well, that was done before I got there. Now, I did get active in it, okay? And that was done by Paul Hogan and Bob Banks originally, who are friends of mine and nice, neat guys. You know, that was initially done on a silica support, although they did use a silica lumen initially, and then the silica, and they found that, you know, that they'd done a lot of things with it. Well, I had a young friend, he was named Max McDaniels, and he's more or less the champion of the area now. And we were talking one time, and I said, Max, if you're going to get a different result, you got to do a different experiment. Why don't you put that on something other than silica? And he says, like what? And I says, well, hell, Max, let's pick the closest analog to silica we can get, which is aluminum phosphate. I was thinking aluminum phosphate, you know, is a similar compound. They're both tetrahedrally coordinated, you know, and structurally it has all the transitions of silica. And I said, more than that, you know, the surface hydroxyls, it probably has alumina, and it probably has phosphate, and when you hook it up to chromium, you got to get something different. And so we did. And I recall real well, it was my anniversary, I think my 35th or something like that. And he and I were making alumina phosphate gels. And of course they were amorphous, you could see absolutely no structure in them at all. And it did turn out that we do make a commercial form of variation of polyethylene, you know, on these aluminum phosphates. And we went on, and later on I think we treated it with HF, and we got yet a different version of the same catalyst, fluorided them. And it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun working with Max. I don't know much about polymerization catalyst. We worked on aluminum phosphates and the metal phosphates for a while, but in our hand, the only real commercial success was the chromium on the aluminum phosphate, which we do use.
Well, how did Clark get involved in theoretical catalysis?
Oh, I think he always had a predilection in that direction. And Al Clark was he was the second senior scientist at Phillips, and he was the guru in catalysis. There was no question about that. When I first came to Phillips, Al got real interested in statistical mechanics. And so he taught us all. We got Hill's book on statistical mechanics, you know, and together a bunch of us went through it. And, well, interestingly enough, I'd taken the same course from Henry Eyring. And Henry was there part of the time, and part of the time he was not. And so part of the time the statistical mechanics course was always taught by one of his postdocs. And I never felt that I had ever, knitted the whole subject together. And so when Al Clark wanted to teach statistical mechanics, I enrolled, and I took the course, and I found out that I had a much better education than I thought from Henry. I didn't learn much new, but I've always felt more comfortable about it. I didn't feel I had the holes in it. But Al was a neat guy. He was very bright, he was very smart, and he was had a real theoretical bent. And he said, Marvin, if you have to pick one area of catalysis, it's got to be adsorption, and particularly chemsorption. And so Al would write, partition functions, essentially, for the absorbed molecules, and on the basis of stability and the structure he would assign to them, he would attempt to cover, the theta, which is the fraction of the surface covered versus the delta H of reaction. And he and I modeled a number of those together, and I think they appeared in his, book on adsorption. But that was his interest, and Al was a real bright, very personable, very nice person, He was just pleasant to be around, and I think largely he was perhaps more than anybody else responsible for, not only doing catalyst preparations, but in helping you to discern what was important and what it looked like and what the catalytic moiety was, and not stopping till you had a reasonable rate expression or could express, the rate of reaction in terms of a number. And once you had that number and that moiety, arrive at a mechanism to make it work. I mean, he always was pushing, beyond the empirical science of catalysis, which so many of us, used. We would just stir things up, or I never did, but a lot of them did, and look at them, rather superficially, and then discard them or something on the basis of their activity. I'll always want to go the one step deeper. And if you found something that was really active or novel, and one other, he wanted to know why and how, and describe it. And I was, I guess, the second senior scientist in catalysis, right after Al, some years after Al. But I went off to the University of Oklahoma, where he taught, a course in absorption, and he also taught in the chemical engineering department down there. He taught kinetics and reactor design. But Al was a classical physical chemist. He was very good, and he was a delight to work around.
Well, if I remember, Holm and Blue were working on radiation. How did chemistry and impact on catalysis?
Well, Dick Blue was, another very smart guy, and Vernon was very creative in the laboratory. And I think one of the achievements one of the things that they saw very early on, many of the catalysts, particularly the chrome dehydrogenation catalyst, I think is really what you're referring to. Fred Fry had discovered the chrome oxide dehydrogenation catalyst. And they used this, to prepare butenes, from butane. It was the catalyst would foul, but initially they found that the activity of that was very closely related to the particle size. And they went ahead and about that same time, Thiel of Amoco had come up with the telemodulus and internal pore diffusion, and Abelhorn Wheeler was very active in it, and I think that Vern and Blue picked up on it and explained much of this success, or much of the difficulty we had had with chrome on aluminum catalysts on the basis of the effectiveness factor and the telemodulus. And it was in many ways ahead of its time, but it was certainly after Bob Thiele had pretty well elucidated internal mass transfer in catalysis.
Did you ever get involved in the homogeneous catalysis?
I always look with some aspects upon it, and maybe that's the result of my engineering education. In the case of rubber, there is no alternative but to homogeneous hydrogenation. When it comes to other hydrogenations, the difficulty with homogeneous hydrogenation is you've always got to get that stuff out of there somehow. You can't sell the product, and if you don't have a low boiling material that comes out of there by distillation and recycle or reuse, you've always got the contamination of the nickel catalyst, or whatever the homogeneous hydrogenation catalyst is, or the homogeneous catalyst. And the cost of that always was prohibitive. It's a great area, it's classical chemistry. You don't have to worry about nonlinear absorption isotherms, or it's chemistry as chemistry was taught. You look at it spectroscopically, you can identify some of the moieties responsible for activity. You can do all of those nice things, but when it comes time to commercialize it, you still have to somehow get that homogeneous catalyst apart and separate it from the mixture, and boy, that's not easy. The only one, I can tell you the story on that one, we did the rubber, and of course you couldn't sell rubber contaminated with nickel and alumina. And so we looked around, and we eventually ended up using ammonium phosphate. We formed a nickel and ammonium phosphate, a nice pale green material. After we'd oxidized the nickel to divalent nickel, added ammonium phosphate and water, precipitated it, added filter aid to increase the stirring, and then we'd filter it out of there. Well, it takes a considerable upgrade in the value of the product to make that possible in every instance. And I don't know if anybody does homogeneous hydrogenation today, other than where they have to remove it, other than by distillation, but it's difficult, and so I just sort of lost interest in it. I was always busy doing something else.
What was your biggest success at the bench that didn't make it commercially?
Oh, I've got a portfolio of solutions looking for problems. I don't know. The thing that I enjoyed most, one day I was thinking that everybody was talking about disposing of used cars. This may sound funny, but this was a big problem. They were lining the streets, you know, in Chicago, and I thought, gee, you know, why don't we cryogenically cool those things down to where we can crush them, you know, real readily, and subdivide them. Rubber, everything will go down, you know, and then we'll use physical means of separation to get rid of all of the products. I mean, the glass, the rubber, the alloy, the ferromagnetic material we can pick up with a magnet, but the copper and the aluminum, one thing that we can do some sort of a separation on, and I thought, boy, that would take care of that problem, you know, and so I patented the darn thing. I don't know whether Phillips ever proceeded, but I turned in a patent idea, and you know, we wrote a case and one thing or other. And the director of research at that time happened to read it, and he said, "Marvin, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life." Well, that was probably right. It never was commercial, but to my defense, about 6 months after we'd had that conversation, and I'd been described in less than glowing terms for the idea, the Germans come up with a similar process, and they announced it was commercial. I never had the courage to walk into his office and thump the article down and say, "See this, Mr. Reed," but I wanted to.
Well,
Oil companies were going to have to, some time ago, there was all this used oil was being scattered all over the roads and the sewers and everything else, and the government was making, you know, threats that the oil companies that sold the oil were going to have to go out and make some effort to reclaim used oil, you know. And all of the processes at that time were sulfuric acid, you know. They would hit it with sulfuric acid, they'd take the sludge out, they would get an oil which was sulfonated, it had higher sulfur content than what they started with, but I mean, it was a method that was used to reclaim used oil. That they weren't very effective, and then what did you do with the sulfuric acid after you'd done it? You know, we were trying to close all the naphtha sulfuric acid pits that we'd used to desulfurize naphtha for years, and so I thought the same thing, that aluminum phosphate would work, ammonium phosphate will precipitate all of the metals in used oil. It will, you know, it'll take in that one case the lead, you know, the zinc, all of the wear metals and one thing or another, and take them down, and moreover it convert all of the calcium and the barium and one thing or other, all make insoluble phosphates. And so I started out and we mix oil and aqueous solutions of ammonium phosphate, we'd drive all the water off, we'd filter out the ammonium phosphate, the insoluble phosphates. The ammonia probably went to a metathesis reaction to form the ammonium sulfonates, and then we'd take this mixture and then we'd hydrogenate it over a conventional catalyst. And particularly if you heated it and decomposed all of the unused zinc dialkyl dithialphosphate, which is an antioxidant and wear agent, you know, in oil. And so we started out to do that. And we looked at it, and gee, I thought it was great. And we had 2 plants actually that run, one in Canada, Shell Canada run one. The Mexicans built a plant, and they ran one, but the difficulty was that you could never collect enough used oil to make it economical in the United States, or when they there. So Phillips never built one, but they licensed, and I don't think they ever recovered all of the money that I spent, but they tried, but we never commercialized it ourselves. I think that parts of the process are used a lot in other countries, you know, where they reclaim used oil. They do the ammonium phosphate precipitation, and then they do other methods of purification. But it worked well. It just we could never get the 10, 12,000, you know, gallons of used oil a day, you know, in the United States to do anything with it. And that's kind of been the story of used oil reclaiming in the U.S. It's picked up as a hazardous waste. I think Safety Clean or other companies, you know, have a process to do it. I don't know what they use, but I think a lot of them, you know, remove the calcium, the zinc, the lead, and all of those things and all of the wear metals from the oil. to prepare an ash-free oil, and I think they use the ammonium phosphate precipitation. And then I think they distill, and I think some cases hydrotreat, which was, the essence of the process. But we were the first people to ever put it all together and to successfully demonstrate that when you recover the lube stock, you have the same lube stock. It has the same signature as the material, you compounded the oil with. But the problem was always trying to find a way to get enough oil to do that on a commercial scale. And Phillips lost interest, and we never went back.